Come on, move yourself!
And they drove it up onto the lines to city on top. Really old one. And they watered it on both ships. Yeah, they not bring them here, and that's what they did. Sitting up there where the lines used to be. But in those days, which would be, I suppose, in the 1960s, that top of those sticks, there's still beautiful tiles on top of those sticks. And my nephew did his architectural thesis on them before. And the tiles are still there, but they've all vanished over the last 20 years, I suppose. Some have been along with it.
We will.
When? You don't know. You have to be at the office on Tuesday, haven't you?
Wednesday.
Oh, well, but one day you didn't work.
Whatever, and they would find you a suitable place to live, and you could live happily in France, provided you promised not to remain. Whereas if you were an ordinary soldier and you were captured, you were thrown in one of the prisoner of war camps that they've got over there, which weren't particularly good.
What happened to the camp followers of a defeated army?
They did the best they could. They did the best they could, actually. As far as camp followers, the camp followers, as opposed to soldiers' wives, there are various groups. You see. You've got, first of all, you've got sort of officers' wives. You've then got soldiers' wives, and then you've got camp followers. Well, camp followers are quite sort of dubious and seedy characters.
Sorry, I think of the officers' wives.
Yeah. Well, again, if the officer was captured, then they were paroled with the officer. You know. If the officer was killed, again, quite often, if they were a titled person or whatever, then they would have connections in England, and they would be treated accordingly. Soldiers' wives were different. If they didn't get married within 7 days, then they starved to death, basically. Because if the husband was killed, then nobody would look after them. So some wives in the peninsula got through about a dozen husbands. As soon as the husband died, they would quit. But there was always a waiting list, because only 1 in 10 was allowed to take their wife over anyway. So there was always a waiting list. If a soldier got killed, you know, there was a waiting list for his wife. All the proposals lining up.
All volunteers, they're not conscripts like the French or other armies. Every man highly trained, part of a small but steady infantry. Not only that, but these are the right infantry, so they're not just capable of plodding about shoulder to shoulder and firing volleys. They can operate as skirmishers, and they're therefore doubly useful. Two infantrymen there who help the gunners fall into the ranks. And behind the 68th march the 95th Rifles. Those of you who have seen Sharp's rifles on the TV might be surprised to see that these rifles are actually rather smart, nor are they particularly unpleasant and belligerent people. They're very smart, they're an elite regiment, and they don't look at all like those people on to open the last show. crash of the 3-pounder, the infantry start to move, with the artillery having fired the opening shot. General Banks presumably now happy that things are starting to proceed again. We see the infantry marching on. At the front we have redcoats, the famous British infantry, in the traditional red coat, worn first of all by the new model army in the English Civil War, but carried on through the ages till today, up to now, on Horse Guards Parade. This is the 68th or Durham Regiment of Light Infantry, crack troops, and they certainly need replacements out in the peninsula because their casualties have been very heavy indeed. Behind them march the 95th Rifles, an elite regiment dressed in the green called the Grasshoppers by the French, deadly shots and the scourge of the French light infantry. Ladies and gentlemen, perhaps you would care to welcome Wellington's army. I'll now hand you over to Sergeant Miller of the 68th, who will tell you about their uniforms, weaponry and tactics.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm just going to start off by comparing the different types of weapon carried by these two regiments. Now, if you look at the gentlemen in green, the 95th Rifles, they're carrying the Baker rifle, designed and manufactured by Ezekiel Baker. It was found in trials to be the best weapon for the British Army. The Army is taking these on as the finest example of mass-produced rifles in Britain. They are accurate up to 300 yards, although they will fire further than that, and in the hands of a good shot will still hit people at ranges beyond that. The problem with the rifles is, well, you have a rifled barrel. This is in the days where you have musket balls. Now, to get the musket ball into the rifle, you have to exert a great deal of force. You have to push the bullet, wrapped in a greased patch, down to the bottom of the barrel, and in doing so, you're going to spend an awful lot of time. You see the rifles going through their loading drill as well as the Durhams. Now you'll notice the Durhams are starting to load. They're all loading by command. The Durhams loading muskets, which are smoothbore, take less time. You can approximately fire 3 rounds from a musket in the same time it takes you to fire 1 from a rifle. Now you can see the riflemen now, they're having to put these rifles between their knees. This is so that when they withdraw the ramrods, they can exert enough pressure to force the ball down to the bottom of the barrel. The light infantry are already loaded. Now you'll also notice that the riflemen are carrying swords by their side. This is because a Baker rifle is shorter than a musket, and if it did come to a bayonet fight, you would have a shorter reach than your enemy, who would be armed with a musket and bayonet. Therefore they gave them swords, which are longer than bayonets, so they had an equal reach. Even to this day, riflemen fix swords rather than fixing bayonets. You now see the riflemen opened out into skirmish order. Now then, as I was saying, a rifle is deadly up to 300 yards. A musket's effective range is around 100 yards. So, between 100 yards and 300 yards away from the enemy, we've got some misfires here. From ranges from 100 to 300 yards away from the enemy, the rifleman is king. He can pick off his enemy with relative impunity. However, when your Frenchman gets within 100 yards of you with his musket and starts firing at you, he can fire 3 shots to every one of yours. You'll notice the amount of smoke produced by the muskets when they fire. Also with the riflemen, you'll notice behind the officer, following him everywhere, is a bugle boy. Buglers were recruited from the age of 12. They could have a very short life or a very long life, depending on how quick they are and how fast the French were to shoot at them. Now the reason that they carry bugles is simply that a bugle will carry over a longer distance than a man. Now then, with these muskets, on a bad day, you could expect none of them to fire. In good weather like this, you can expect 1 in 3 to be misfires. These muskets have been firing over the past couple of days. Flints are getting rather warm. Flints are unusual things. You could get a flint, and it will fire 300 rounds. It will last you forever, seemingly. However, you can get another flint that will shatter on the first shot. You can hear the sounds of men tapping, removing flints and changing them. Another volley now from the line troops. There's no need for camouflage. At 100 yards, when you fire at your enemy, the smoke tells them immediately where you're at. They would now... Now, when looking at the Durham's uniforms, you will now notice that they are wearing the red coat. You'll also notice on their shoulders they're wearing wings. These are to allow them to fly into battle. You'll notice at the far end there's an officer. Now this chap's actually not wearing regulation uniform. He's obviously a bit fashion conscious. He's got his jacket open, hasn't got it fastened, as regulations state. The cut perhaps is just a little bit different from regulation. Perhaps he's got his tailor to do one or two things that are currently fashionable that he particularly likes. He has a large amount of silver lace on it. He's probably quite upset he's not a captain. If he was a captain, silver bullion on his necklace that are on his shoulders. Nearest to us, you'll notice that there's another sergeant. This is Sergeant Naylor. Very kind, gentle man. Any of the men will tell you that. You'll notice that he is wearing a jacket that's a slightly brighter shade of red than the rest of the men. And he's also wearing 3 large stripes on either arm. This is so that he's readily identifiable. Unfortunately, it also makes him identifiable by the French. Now the officer seems to have spotted something. There appears to be some French on his right flank. He's getting his men to fall back to face that threat. Again, coming back to the officer, you can perhaps get a good view now of his white breeches, and he's actually wearing Hessian riding boots, which is very unusual, you might think, particularly since he'll never ever get near a horse. He's even wearing spurs. However, being a light infantryman, being fashion conscious, he's well aware of the fact that he should look good, and wearing riding boots is a mark of his station in life. The Durhams now, having driven off the threat on their flank, correct their frontage. The officer is now retiring his troops. Perhaps they've goaded the French into attacking. The sergeant then retires the men. Retires through his own line. The rear rank of the Durhams now loads, while the front rank covers it. The worst thing for light infantry in this formation would be to be caught by cavalry. When you do see the cavalry later on, I want you to imagine what it would be like to be caught by a couple of hundred cavalrymen charging down on you whilst you're in open order like this. The rear rank is now loaded. There's a number of misfires there. The officer now retires his troops behind the rifles. They're now going to give a volley. The sergeant tells them to close and lock up. The sergeant sergeant is continually shouting at the men to dress. This is to straighten the line. It means that you look to your man on your right and you take your dressing from him, you take your line from him. Now this is extremely difficult on this terrain. They're actually on a slope and coming over ground that's quite rough. They now move into the light infantry pace, 140 to the minute. Now, when you're doing light infantry manoeuvres, at no point do you actually stop. If you want to change direction, you just keep moving. In fact, all light infantry drill is designed to keep troops moving at all times. They also carry the musket at the advance arms. This is at the right hand side and the right arm. It means that the overall height of the man is reduced. Now from behind you'll be able to get a good view of the crossbelts. On the right buttock is the cartridge box. On the left is the bayonet, the haversack and the water canteen. All the canteens bearing the regimental number, company number, the number of the canteen, not of the man. The canteen's more valuable than the man. A hedge of bayonets to the horses. You hope that a horse has got more sense than a man and will shy away from the point. And this will protect you from being ridden over. It might help, but in the long run, if you stand like this, you're going to be cut down by cavalry. It affords you some protection and might save some lives if you have reserves available to help you. This gives you a good view of the bayonets or the swords of the riflemen. Now then, you're about to see the bayonets of the light infantry. The light infantry bayonet is 17 inches of triangular steel. It's fluted down two sides. This is so when you stick it in somebody, the suction doesn't make it stick. If you've got the fluting, you can give it a bit of a wriggle and it comes out. You're now going to have a bayonet charge demonstrated to you, ladies and gentlemen. You'll notice it's extremely slow. There's no point in running 100 yards to collapse exhausted and breathless in front of your enemy. The idea is to impress him into the fact that you mean to attack him and to frighten him by your determined show. That way he runs away. Throughout the wars, there were very few bayonet fights. One side usually ran. Fortunately for the British, it was usually the French. You'll notice that they gradually pick up pace. If you imagine whether you are, ladies and gentlemen, is the French line, when they got to this distance, they would start moving quicker. Then they would come down to the charge bayonet, and only at the last moment would they charge. The idea was to arrive all together at the same time.
But what these cavalry are used for, like every other soldier through ages, is to kill the enemy. And the weapons they use aren't particularly subtle, and indeed, a wound from a sabre is hideous. This particular unit of cavalry, as they come round, you'll be able to get a closer look at their uniforms, is the 13th or Prince of Wales' own Light Dragoons. They wear a French-style uniform, because the Prince of Wales, or Prinita, his friends, having seen the captured Polish uniform, the Poles fought for the French, he liked it so much, he decided to dress his regiment in the same uniform. You imagine the chaos if the 13th had then gone out to the peninsula, whilst the British infantry were still used to French troopers wearing this uniform. They would have thought they were being attacked from behind when the 13th came up behind them. However, this set a fashion, and very shortly afterwards, all the British Light Dragoons were re-equipped in this French-style uniform. It consists of a blue coat with different collars and cuffs. You see them coming down past the tree line. Even at this distance, they're quite conspicuous. Again, the idea isn't really to conceal your troops in Napoleonic warfare, except for the rifles, of course, is to make them look as attractive as possible, as an imposing force to frighten the enemy. They break into a trot, and next into a canter. And here they come at a canter, column of twos. To get an idea of how frightening it would be to be chased by this regiment. They wave their sabres in the air in salute. You've got 600 of them coming towards you waving hurrah. You'd be a frightened man indeed. Now the idea now is to stop the horses, of course, love to go forward at the gallop before they plough into the tent lines. With cavalry you need lots and lots of space. We've only got a limited amount of space here, so obviously the cavalry can't go at full gallop, as they'd soon disappear or crash into something. But you'll get the idea. Now they'll be walking round a little bit closer to you. They wear on their heads the French-style shako, just like Fusilier Capelin had on a little bit earlier. It's made of felt and leather, and it's not there just for decoration. It has a very important practical purpose. In cavalry warfare, quite often the opposing force will be armed with slashing sabres like these, and the simplest way to disable an enemy is to slash down onto his head. In the 18th century, soldiers wore three-cornered hats called tricorns, which didn't have much protection at all, and so many a trooper found himself cut through the skull. Now these hats are designed in such a way that ideally, if somebody slashes at you with a sabre, the sabre will stop, cutting the skull. It'll get stuck in the leather top before it reaches the skull. Doesn't always work, but at least it's there some of the time. It's useful most of the time. On their shoulders they wear white epaulettes. These are made of cloth with fringe on. They're there for decoration now, but they're one of the last vestiges of armour, because in medieval times a lot of armoured knights would wear epaulettes. The armour to protect their shoulders, be made of steel. But now, in the Napoleonic period, no armour's worn, because the idea is to get the troops performing at speed and wearing attractive uniforms. As always, the military is dominated by fashion. You saw our dandified fashion victim leading the 68th there, and the Prince of Wales is no exception, and that's why he's dressed up his dragoons like this, very smart uniform. Like the infantry, they wear leather belts, only for different purposes. One belt around the waist holds up the sword in its scabbard, and also
well to the right. Right. Well.
Sorry about that, my PA went dead on me, but I've got the spare here. And they also wear the equivalent of a leather handbag, called a sabretache, in which the soldiers keep their orders and useful items. It's a throwback really to the times when cavalry breeches were so tight that you couldn't actually have any pockets in them, so instead they had these leather sabretaches on the left hip, and as they clatter past you'll be able to get a look at those. The sabre scabbards are steel, and the leather equipment is white buff leather. Now on the back the soldiers also carry a pouch in which they keep ammunition for their pistols and carbines. You'll see the pistol in use a bit later on. The thing to bear in mind when you see these cavalry manoeuvring is the sheer speed. Infantry march at a sedate pace, as you saw. Cavalry can catch them up very easily indeed. And when we get to the stage where the cavalry are ready to demonstrate some of the more deadly aspects of their weaponry, poor old Fusilier Capelin will earn his pay once again. The 1796 curved light cavalry sabre is so deadly that the French wrote to the king to complain about it. They thought it was unsporting. It's razor sharp down one edge, the leading edge, and you can also use it with the razor sharp point. The rear edge is of course blunt, otherwise the soldiers wouldn't have any shoulders when they're carrying the sabre at the carry. This sword is generally used to hack and cut, unlike the French light cavalry, who tended to use the point. And it meant that when the cavalry were fighting each other, they'd actually have two very different styles of warfare. The light cavalry sabre, although very, very nasty, would tend to inflict hideous wounds rather than kill soldiers outright, whereas the French stabbing sword would leave an enemy generally dead, because a thrust from a sabre is more deadly than a cut. All his personal possessions, and has a black shako. And what he's going to do is to demonstrate for the benefit of General Banks to see how nifty the cavalry are. He's getting orders from the General, and you can see the Dragoons take out their fearsome 1796 pattern light cavalry sabre, razor sharp down the leading edge and with a point so deadly that the French wrote to complain that it was unsporting. So you can see Kaplan standing there with the ladies of the salon. It's probably the nearest he's ever got to fashionable English ladies. He carries the French infantry musket called a Charleville, and having been captured in the battle is now earning a little bit of additional pay by being a bit of a target. So he's going to demonstrate what happens when a French column is defeated and in desperation turns and runs. He's going to try and fire his musket, but of course he's been in action, so it's probably not loaded, but of course being a soldier in the heat of battle, he's forgotten this. So he'll stand his ground, he'll try and shoot at the Dragoon. He realises he's not firing, and he's off. Let's see how long it takes the cavalry to catch an infantryman running. And there he goes. And he's down. Ladies and gentlemen, have an applause for the brave Private Kaplan. Of course, this is just for training purposes, and so the Dragoons are going forward to make sure that the Light Dragoon hasn't actually severed his head. Kaplan looks a little bit bruised, but I think he's alive and kicking, and they're dragging him off. Poor old Kaplan. Well, he's earned his pay there, and I think General Banks will be willing to give him rather a lot of money for acting as a decoy there for the training of his troops. But they're a much smaller target than the French Fusilier. So you have to imagine that although Fusiliers move about, he's actually harder to hit a stationary turnip because he's much smaller. These cavalrymen will be closing at a speed approximately 20 miles an hour on their target, and at that speed and the distance, it's actually difficult to see the turnip, never mind hit it. But if they can cut it with the sabre, you'll get an idea of what could have happened to an average Frenchman's head, because being tall, what you do with your cavalry sabre is to cut downwards, and if you don't want to cut through the shako, you can simply cut it in the neck or cutting down through the shoulder blades. Very nasty indeed. Here we go, look at the speed of that. And the whole pole's got not just the turnip, and the second trooper, he missed his turnip, but never mind, he might have got the Frenchman. This one coming forward, two of them together, and they both got the pole, so that would be 4 dead Frenchmen there. So that gives you an idea, ladies and gentlemen, of the speed and terrifying deadliness of these cavalry. And there goes the sergeant cantering across. One of the poles now useless, but I believe our cavalryman in stable dress there is setting up 1 or 2 more turnips so they can have another go. Just watch as these sabres flash. If they can cut at the turnip or the melon, especially the melon, if they cut the melon open, it will do a very good approximation to a Frenchman's head. And you'll see exactly how vicious these swords are and how nasty being on the receiving end of light cavalry would have been. All the swords used here are actually originals, I understand. So the cavalry are divided into 2 parties, and we're going to see who goes first. There he goes. Horse playing up a bit there. He's going after the melon. And he's cut it. That gives you the top of a soldier's head. Now the turnip, and he's cut the turnip. Very good. Oh, he missed. Still, the turnip's very small indeed. Here's the next man. Just cut a bit there. Oh, and there goes the second turnip. You notice the swords were used in different way there. The trooper galloping from the left had his sword straight out. He was going to go with a point, and at the last minute he turned it into a cut, whereas the trooper coming from the right went straight forward with the sword poised over the head for a downward cut. There are lots of different ways you can cut with the sabre, but all of them nasty, as you can see. Pretty ghastly, eh? It's enough to give you sympathy for the French. Of course, the French did this to the English as well, so it's all fair, really. See, it's not a very glamorous uniform. That's because it's mucking out the horses and doing things around the camp that you can't do in your full-dress uniform that the troopers are wearing, because you'd ruin it. sabre. Missed. Missed again. Never mind, the Frenchman's a bigger target. Look at that, whack. And again, well done. The trick, of course, is to actually stop the horse before it gallops into the tent. Another good cut there. Bear in mind you're seeing something virtually unique here, because there hasn't been cavalry doing this ever before, not since Napoleonic times. The first time this has been done. And you're not only seeing cavalry training here, but of course you've got to bear in mind the horses are also learning this, because we don't have any real live Napoleonic horses, because they died of old age rather a long time ago. And so these troopers not only are learning how to do this, but they're learning to control their mounts, who might necessarily have better ideas than charging towards a post with a turning. All the horses, of course, are probably starting off getting a bit confused because they're being whacked in the side by the sabre-tash and the sabre scabbard. And of course, if you nudge a horse to the side, it thinks it's time to go forward. And every time these horses take a step, it's like they're being urged on further by the equipment clattering against them. So the horse has to learn to differentiate between a genuine order to go forward and the simple clatter of equipment. And that go these deadly 96 pattern sabres. Most of those there are originals in actual fact, so may have been used on the French at some time or other. Now, the sabre wasn't the only weapon of the cavalry, although it was the most useful. I've said that these cavalry are light dragoons. They're light cavalry. They're different from the heavy cavalry that were the equivalent of a Napoleonic tank. The heavy cavalry, big men on big horses, would have been used en masse to batter their way through enemy formations. These are light cavalry. They're used before, during and after a battle, and now we're going to see what they did before a battle. Two men are coming out of the ranks here. The reason they're called light cavalry is because they're smaller men on smaller horses, and they have duties that are similar to the light infantry. Skirmishing, patrol, escort duty, that sort of thing. An encampment like this, once in enemy territory, would have to be guarded against surprise attack. And so there would be a concentric ring of vedettes, or scouts, out around the camp at some distance, possibly a pair of men, closer up a formed unit of supports. And they would be armed with firearms, because it's much easier to warn the camp with a pistol or a carbine shot than wave your arms around and shout. Now these four troopers here are loading their pistols, and you can see how difficult it is to load a pistol on horseback, because it's much easier to drop anything. You can't pick it up like an infantryman could. The pistols are specifically designed for cavalry use, in so much as the ramrods, which are absolutely indispensable, are part of the pistol. If they had a ramrod like an ordinary infantryman would have, and they dropped it, they wouldn't be able to pick it up, and the pistol would be useless. And so it's on a swivel, and it goes into the barrel, and you can't drop it. Like the muskets, first of all you put in your priming charge into the little pan near the trigger. Then you place the ball and the rest of the cartridge and the powder down the barrel and ram it down with the ramrod. These pistols are unbelievably inefficient. Even at short range you'll probably miss the enemy. You might as well throw the pistol at him, it's going to be more accurate. But they're very, very useful for signalling, and that's really what they're for.
Good. Turn to the right, single file. Work. Left. Close up on the front.
Now they're going to use the same targets, the turnips again, to represent enemy soldiers, because in pursuit they could fire their pistols at fleeing soldiers, although they would prefer to use their swords really. And this is really to show you whether or not the pistols are going to go off. You've seen lots of misfire, starting with the cannon, but you haven't seen anything yet. If these pistols are true to course, we'll be lucky to get half of them going off. The powder charge is smaller, which means it's easier for it to blow out or fall out of hand. And being a flintlock, again, it suffers from all the problems of the flintlock mechanism. It might spark, but the spark might not go into the priming pan, or the priming might go off, but the main charge in the barrel might not go off. We'll see. There goes the first pair of troopers. This, of course, also acclimatises the horses to the sound of gunfire, because horses aren't necessarily used to it. Although, in fairness to the horses, they're not really bothered by loud bangs. It's really flashing objects and flags and other things waving in the breeze that upset them. So they walk down to the other end of the display area, and they'll turn about, and then I think then we'll go helpful at the targets. Troopers were also armed with carbines, but we don't have them here today because they're almost unobtainable, sadly, nowadays. Also because of the short length of the barrel, they're classed as firearms, which makes it even harder, because the police don't like us to keep them. Notice again how the accoutrements sparkle in the sunshine. Very attractive sight, but not if you're a Frenchman. The French light cavalry would have looked very similar indeed. In fact, so similar that in a straight battle you might have ended up not knowing who you were fighting, one man on your side or another. On campaign, they'd cover their shakoes to protect them with a black oilskin cover or perhaps a white linen one, and they'd roll a greatcoat over their shoulders to protect their bodies from sword cuts. That made it even more difficult to tell who was who. Right, the sergeant gives us instructions, and here goes the first man. Amazing. Let's see how the other two soldiers fare. There we go. And together. Ah, a misfire. Well, 3 out of 4. That's not bad at all, is it, ladies and gentlemen? Just 6 horses here, you can clearly hear the sound of the hooves. If you're on the ground next to them, you could feel the hooves as they gallop past. Imagine a brigade of 800 light cavalry charging towards you, the thunder of the hooves deafening, the view halloo of the officers leading their men, the cheering of the soldiers, and the sheer terror if you're on the receiving end. Now you might think that 2 cavalry regiments clashing would pile up like a huge motorway crash, the regiments smashing into each other at high speed and being flung in all directions. Not so. A lot of infantry expected to see this when they saw 2 opposing regiments charge, but as they got close up, one of 2 things would happen. Quite often, they'd go forward at the full charge, and then they'd begin to slow down bit by bit, until when they reached the enemy side, they'd actually be looking at each other and poking each other at swords, but not doing much else. This happened a lot. The alternative, which did happen at Waterloo, 2 regiments literally went right through each other. The ranks opened up, they went past through between the enemy horsemen, a bit of a hack, a bit of a slash with the swords, and out the other side, with not much in the way of damage to either side. So quite often cavalry is more show than anything else. So there we have it, light cavalry at their finest, useful before a battle in reconnaissance, in scouting duties, and everything else. During a battle, in straight combat, and at their most deadliest in the pursuit of a broken enemy. Out come the sabres again for a final march past, because with a general here on parade, you're not going to walk off without, first of all, trooping past the general. One of the horses playing up there a bit. Eyes right to General Banks there, who salutes. Thinking to himself, what jolly good fellows, let's ship them off to the peninsula. And finally we have to remember the downside of cavalry. These make a virtually unmissable target for the artillery. Quite often, half a regiment of cavalry could be maimed or killed, waiting in line, waiting to go into action. The screams of the horses, the terrible wounds on them, must have been a heart-wrenching sight. The sound must have been appalling. And of course, unlike the soldiers, they didn't have any choice. There again, I suppose the soldiers didn't have much choice either. Ladies and gentlemen, I give you the 13th Light Dragoons of the troop. Pounders. These guns are often used in mass batteries, and we sat on a ridge, pouring death and destruction at some range indeed, over 1,000 yards, very easily indeed. And even if a cannonball rolls towards you very slowly, you might think it's lost its power, but it's a well-known fact that an officer once put his foot out to stop a cannonball rolling very slowly, and it took his foot off. these things are very nasty indeed. They can also fire canister, musket balls. There we are, with all the smoke, confusion of battle caused by the artillery. You can see why the artillery often earned the name of the real killers of the battlefield. Mass barrages of artillery fire were terrifying and totally deafening. And he's
Oh! Good. Well to the left. Walk. Walk. March.
very sensibly the trooper wheeling off to the left. So our officer there, Mr. Gibson, will fire his cannon when he's ready. You'll notice there's 2 infantrymen assisting. When the artillery was short-handed, they could draw the most intelligent infantrymen, if they could find any, and they would help with the loading of the gun. Now we'll see how quickly they can reload as they fire a second shot. Remember, these guns will be used in mass batteries, and if you're in an infantry column, French infantry column, maybe 100 men across by 20 deep, you would have to run the gauntlet of these things, each cannonball ploughing through every rank in turn, knocking the men down like skittles, maiming them and killing them, stone dead, very nasty. And if you survive that, you get within killing range of the canister, and suddenly your front ranks start to get blown away by the musket balls flying out en masse. To make matters worse, the Duke of Wellington was a brilliant tactician and would place his troops on top of a hill, not on the top where the enemy artillery could shoot at him, but on the reverse slope. So if you're the French, you don't see the British at all, they're over the brow of that hill, and in the background, about 5 paces behind. So your infantry toil all the way down the hill, and you get to the top, and you're met with this. Oh, another misfire. Well, they probably all go off, sooner or later. Let's see if we can get it to go. As I say, your French column goes up the hill, the officers have been hit by rifle fire, cannonballs. You get to the top of the hill, and suddenly, rising out the ground, is a whole battalion of British infantry, hidden from artillery fire, ready to give one volley and charge you with the bayonet. So, there we are, that's the artillery, and now I believe the infantry will come forward for Major General Banks' inspection, because wherever you have a top brass man from Whitehall, you have inspections. And as the sergeant pointed out earlier, it's quite possible that Major General Banks has never seen a shot fired in anger, and rides a desk and does all the paperwork. I'm not sure he's very happy with what I'm saying, but never mind. But he's still a very important man, because it's his job to make sure that these troops are ready to go off to the peninsula. You can see he's got his secretary with him, dressed in a rather natty civilian outfit. And we'll now review the troops. First, the 68th come around. You'll notice the 2 infantry who have helped the gunners are ready to fall into the ranks. And then behind the 68th march the 95th. And I believe shortly the cavalry should reappear and take their place in the line also. You're seeing Napoleonic troops perhaps at their most attractive today. This is perfect weather because all the buckles and buttons sparkle. If the troops fixed bayonets, you would see that the bayonets would sparkle also, which makes it very pretty but also more intimidating. Whilst the infantry spend a long time cleaning their equipment and polishing everything and whitening their belts with pipe clay, which is a messy business, the cavalry spend many more hours, because not only have they got to clean their own accoutrements, they've got to look after their horses as well. So these cavalry have been up from dawn, making sure the horses are groomed and the equipment is clean and ready for the parade. And after the parade, they'll have to start all over again, because when you ride about on a horse and get it all lathered up, it makes all the equipment mucky, and so you've got to clean it again. So it may look glamorous being a cavalryman, but it's actually tremendously hard work. And for every hour the infantry put in, the cavalrymen probably put in 2 or 3. The infantry then change face. A strange little manoeuvre, but it's designed to make sure that the man who is on the right hand of the front rank is still on the right hand of the front rank when the troops turn to the rear. So Sharp's rifles may be exciting, but it's not very authentic, I'm afraid. Also at the front of the 95th you'll see the bugle boy, a boy of extreme youth, perhaps an orphan, perhaps brought up by the army. He'll continue to serve, possibly reaching sergeant if he's lucky one day. That's if he's not killed first by a French musket ball, which does not discriminate age at all. The 68th changed front, so everybody's facing the right way and in the correct position. Dragoons sit upon their horse. General waits for the troops to be ready. And he'll know when they're ready when the officers come out to invite him to begin the inspection.
On front, petrol sword, draw, sword.
He marched at, and the French, and the Austrians, and the Prussians, and everybody else. Marched into a storm of shell, musket fire, sabres, everything. It took a lot of bravery to do this. British troops were volunteers. They weren't conscripts like everybody else, but it did mean that our army was pretty small. But the British infantry had the reputation of being perhaps the steadiest in Europe, very difficult to beat, and there were very, very few occasions when the troops of the Duke's army turned tail and ran. Now you'll see the 17-inch triangular bayonets come out, totally terrifying. In a bayonet charge, the troops would close at very slow speed, and then at the last minute they break into a charge, and inevitably one side would break and run. Fortunately for us, usually the French. General looking on, probably quite pleased with what he sees. All these men look ready enough to be sent off to join their regiments in the peninsula. The 68th open their ranks. The rear rank marches back, 95th do the same, and that means the General can walk down the ranks without getting squashed. The other thing you may have noticed is the extreme youth of the 95th Bugle Boy. You could join the army when you were 12, and unfortunately for you, you could stop a musket ball just like anybody else. The chap braid has got a gold eaglet on his shoulder, and he has a white feather plume along his bicorn hat. Not many of the soldiers wear bicorns, only the general there and our artillery officer wear bicorns. They're very much a fashionable accessory that officers can wear. They are derived from the old three-cornered hats. Then one time somebody decided to flatten them a bit and wear them from side to side as a bicorn hat. And then another fashion victim decided it might be nice to point it fore and aft. And gradually the bicorn took shape until you reached the style you see there. It blows off very easily and it's not very useful for very much, but it does show that the gentleman is a gentleman and an officer. See the general passing through the ranks fairly quickly. He's obviously very pleased with the turnout of the 95th. Each man there a crack shot, possibly a gamekeeper or something in civilian life. Most of the 95th would have been able to shoot probably before they even joined, although if they didn't, they'd soon be taught how to. The general now pauses in front of the officer of the 68th and passes along the front rank. Seems to have recognised a veteran soldier there, perhaps someone who's fought before and has re-enlisted. He seems to be happy enough with the infantry there, pausing to have a quick look at the back of the troops. One of the soldiers is of course a pioneer. He wears a leather apron and he has a beard. It's his job to do some of the more unpleasant tasks around the camp, including slaughtering the camp cattle for the food, and he also has to chop down trees on the line of march. He's the only soldier allowed to have a beard. And finally the general approaches the Dragoons, perhaps his favourite.
Well, Prince of Wales is going light Dragoons. Shoulder, gun.
They shoulder swords.
Gun.
And they bring their swords to the carry position for the inspection. The general, of course, will be a skilled horseman himself, although in London he would probably prefer to ride around in a carriage to emphasise his importance and rank. He has, of course, with him his entourage of civilian ladies and gentlemen in the salon, and after the show you will be invited to go up and meet them and allow them to witter at you about fashion, if you can take it. Yeah, the general seems to be very pleased indeed.
I was going to have him flogged, sir.
And the infantry close up again. I imagine now he'll call upon the men for 3 hearty cheers for the king, which is King George III, of course. A very successful king, although by this time 1 or 2 bricks short of the Barbie, as you might say.
Right brigade!
Which is why the
3 cheers for His Majesty King George III! Long may he reign! Hit him head!
Ladies and gentlemen, Wellington's army will have a
National salute, ladies and gentlemen. Now it's time. Please salute Wellington's Army.